Did you get any RSVPs, Sherry? Should we assume this is it?
Heather's gonna be a little late, and
Okay.
Leo could not attend. I did not hear anything from Mary.
Okay.
And let me,
And no one from the broader Mensa group.
no,
Okay. No
I
worries.
think we have it so that you can share. I think it's set up fine now, but
No, not yet.
not yet.
No, the host, you have to enable multiple hosts or something.
Oh, multiple, okay. How's that looking?
There we go. Yeah.
Okay. I better turn my phone volume down because I had it on the highest ringer to do my alarm. Oh, God.
Well, I've got a full deck of slides and I'm a J on the Myers-Briggs, so I'm tempted to start. So tell me if I should wait, if we should wait another minute or two, or if I should just get started.
I think you could just get started.
All right, let me share my screen. I'm going to share screen 2. You should be seeing Big Sur in a hyper stylized graphic.
We got it.
Okay. Well, let me start. And let me start by just saying that this was really hard to prepare for. So I normally deliver this stuff over 4 to 6 hours, 5 to 6 hours when I do actual Myers-Briggs sessions with clients. And I intend to offer it as a class. I'm getting ready to launch an online school later this year. And it'll be one of the classes I offer, which will be the full version of this, including a lot of exercises and sharing and kind of follow-up work. And that'll be 3 months. So good luck if we'll see what we can cover in 60 minutes. But I say that because it's such a high level. And there's actually so many layers to this and so much depth. And I'm just going to kind of give a high level overview of what the Myers-Briggs is and what the 4 dimensions are. But then you can really get into what are the dynamics of these two when they're paired together, and what are the dynamics when this type of personality works with this type of, I mean, it's very, very interesting and very, very deep. That's why I like it, actually. So I've been a practitioner of this for at least 15 years and have been a fan pretty much all my life. So anyway, so just that to say, I'm keeping this at a very high level. There's much, much more. If you think you'd like to know more, stand by, because I will be offering it as a class later in the year, I hope. So let me just start with, I call this understanding humans, but because that's what I think the Myers-Briggs type indicator is best suited for, right? And so just kind of an overview of how I see the Myers-Briggs stuff. It's simply 4 dimensions of human preferences. And we all have lots of preferences. Just between the 5 of us on the call, we have morning people and we have night people, and we have vanilla and we have chocolate, and we have right-handed. Any left-handers here? Do we have any left-handed people? Nope, we all have a preference for right hand. So we have people who think they prefer the world, to see the world as a safe place, and we have people who see the world as an unfavorable and possibly dangerous place. We have people who are people-oriented and people who are task-oriented. And if any of you have taken the DISC before, those last 2 are the dimensions that the DISC profile is built upon. So these are just 4 dimensions of human preference. I will stress preferences a lot because that's what the Myers-Briggs is about. It's attempting to uncover preferences. We all have preferences. These 4 in lots of things, and these 4 just happen to be 4 that are really useful, back to my initial title, in understanding humans. So I think the first step is to understand yourself. And then once you do that, you begin to understand others. And the real power comes when you learn how to leverage the differences between you and other people, and you build teams and you seek out relationships, and especially in a working environment. If you've got work to do, you want to build teams that have a complement of all these preferences so that you're not, overloaded on one versus the other. So I find it just a really powerful set of insights into how people understand and engage with the world. And once you start to see these, it's almost comical. I mean, there's just so many examples in day-to-day life where people will be like, we should do this, we should just ban email. And I just laugh because I know that person falls on the extroverted end of the spectrum, or we need more research, or we need more data. Like, we don't need more data, we just need to move on. And that's an S versus N battle. And so it really is a fun kind of insight. I find it most relevant in communication and relationships. And so it plays well into my work with organizations and leadership development and coaching, because it is just such a quick way to get at some of the fundamental ways people relate to each other, the way they understand themselves. So I find that's its most useful place. And then, as what is the Myers-Briggs indicator? It is an instrument, and it is administered by certified practitioners. And I will kind of stress that as well, because there's a lot of bunk in the, and I'll come back to this in a bit, but there's a lot of bunk out there about, is this, valid? And is this, it's, I find those questions ridiculous, and I'll explain why in a minute. But basically, it is an indicator that can only be administered officially by certified practitioners, and they have access to tools that help them do that, and materials that they make available to people. I normally don't, I normally spend at least, like I said, at least 6 hours with someone over the course of 3 to 4 sessions. And I may or may not use an online tool to make an assessment. I find them kind of neither here nor there. It depends how much time we have. I can kind of get a quick jump start if I send you off on one of their assessments, but they're rather pricey, so I can accomplish the same thing. You can accomplish the same thing. They're your preferences, and we simply just have to uncover them. So a little bit of history. It's actually based on the work of Carl Jung. And so you probably know that Carl Jung was really kind of revolutionary in his understanding of this idea of a spectrum of introversion and extroversion. But he also did real work on how do we take in information? How do we kind of get information into our brains? And how do we make decisions? And those 3 categories are kind of the foundation of the Myers-Briggs. In the 1940s, a woman named Catherine Briggs, is that right? Yeah, Catherine Briggs was familiar with Jung's work, and she really saw some practicality to this. And along with her daughter, Isabella Myers, yeah, so Catherine Briggs and her daughter, Isabella Myers, kind of got really excited about this work of Carl Jung, and how do we put this into practice, and how do we make it more helpful and more useful to people? So they began working with children, actually, and this was in the early 1940s. And right about then, World War II hit, and there was this incredible need to get women into the workforce, and as quickly and as productively as possible. So they then began to really look at and branch out, how can we enable women in the workforce more quickly? So that's kind of how this work originated. It was, how do we streamline, optimize getting people into the workforce in a way that is productive and satisfying for everyone. So it is the most researched, to my knowledge anyway, this was according to my certification, the most researched psychological instrument in the world, partially because the data is very protected. And that's probably controversial, but I think it has its benefits. So there's only one nonprofit organization that is allowed to write the tests and write the assessments, administer the assessments, and certify professionals. And then there's another nonprofit organization that does most of the research and then trains people, does all of the research, most of the research. They might make the data available to others, I would assume, and certifies the practitioners. So it's highly protected. It's been going on. There's at least 60 years of data now. And so they have a lot of information about how these types and how these preferences interact with one another, how they play off in various situations and various scenarios, and they've got a lot of career data mapped against it. I'll make a case in the future that none of the types are predictive, so they don't actually predict careers, but they can show that some people in some careers do better with certain types. I find that to be a fairly small subset, that in general, most people of any type can do anything they want. They will just do that differently than other people. And I love to give the example there of actors. There's actors of all different types, and they all act very differently, but they all can be very good actors. They just do it in their own way. So a few thoughts on what the MBTI is not, and I will drive this home a few times because it is one of my hot buttons, and I've been known to write letters to podcast hosts and comment on blogs, because people will ask, is the Myers-Briggs a valid test? Is it valid? Have you taken the test? And I know immediately, right? So if you look at some article, if you Google validity Myers-Briggs and look at the articles, the moment they mention it as a validity or a test, I know they have no idea what they're talking about. They do not understand this instrument. It is not a test. It has never been administered as a test. It has always been an exploration of preferences. And even if I use an online assessment and we try to jumpstart what your preferences are, we'll come back with an indication of what they are in the 4 categories. categories in the 4 dimensions, about 75% of the time, one of those turns out to be incorrect. What do I mean by that? That by the time we spend 3 or 4 hours talking about it, you realize that what came back on the assessment isn't in fact what your preferences are. So what your preferences are is what your preferences are. And in a few cases, I've actually gone back, and this is part of being a certified practitioner. I go back into that person's assessment and update it to say that, well, it assessed as one thing, but they reported as another. And what they report at is what their Myers-Briggs personality type is. So again, it's this whole idea that is it a test is just ridiculous and shows me that the person knows nothing about what they're talking about. It's also not a label. I had people, a friend actually, who was really reluctant to do an assessment with me. I really wanted to help them. And I could, if I could give them a chance to explain, they had a very strong preference for introversion. And he didn't want that label. It's like, it's not a label. It's simply a way of understanding what your preferences are and then hopefully maximizing them. It's not related to skills or abilities. There's good introverted accountants and extroverted accountants. There's introverted actors and I mean, it's just not related to that. It's not an excuse. I've heard people say that, well, I'm sorry, I'm an introvert and I couldn't do that. That's not an excuse. Introverts can be extroverted. We learn how to do that. It's a set of social skills. It has nothing to do with your preference for introversion. So, and it is absolutely not a guide for hiring people. So if you know anyone who's applying for a job and is being asked to take the Myers-Briggs, I would stay away from that company because now it's good for team building. It's fantastic for team building. So if that's what their purpose is and trying to, integrate you into a team, if you've already been hired and they want to integrate you into a team, great. But it is certainly not a screening tool for hiring people. And I may have said this already, but it's not a test. So in case there's any question, it's about preferences. And so it's about this sense of these 4 in particular are pretty consistent through our lifetimes. We all have a default preference in each of the 4 categories. And people often ask me, or people often get the sense that they change over time. And it's a little more nuanced than that. So our default preferences are pretty much who we are, how we're deeply wired. They show up very early in life. When my niece was very young, she's 17 now, but I remember very distinctly when she was 1 or 2 years old, it was obvious to me already at less than a year that she was extroverted. And I am validated. She is very, very extroverted. The person who did my certification actually was doing research on whether they could determine in utero. So actually, even before the baby's born, could they determine if the child was introverted, had a preference for introversion or extroversion? What does happen though, even though we have a default preference, is it does moderate over our lifetimes. So when we're young, in my experience in working with this for about 15 years now, is, into our teens and even through our 20s, we stay pretty true to our default preference because that's our comfort zone and that's our super spot. That's where we're strong. But the older we get, the more comfortable we get in that space. And we start to branch out into the other. So using my preference, I have a very strong preference for introversion. I'm pegged almost all the way to the left on that preference. And in my 20s, I was extremely introverted. I rarely went out. It was difficult for me to engage socially. I actually was pretty lacking in social skills too. So those two didn't help each other. But now that I'm older, I'm much more comfortable in kind of pushing myself into more extroverted environments. So it moderates. And all it means is that as we mature, we get more comfortable in the other. In fact, we start to experiment in the other. We start to reach into the other side because it's a stretch of who we are and kind of an expansion of our personality. So in that sense, it moderates. So someone who tells me I used to be an introvert, what I hear there is that they have a fairly strong preference for introversion, and they've trained themselves on how to be more social, how to be more extroverted. You'll see from some of the other 2 preferences, no one ever says I used to be intuitive or I used to be feeling. They never, it's really just the stigma against introversion that our culture has. And it's an American stigma, by the way. I'll get to that later because we have this thing about introversion in America. Each dimension is a spectrum. And I am going to be speaking in very general terms, which kind of speaks to the end of both spectrums. So obviously, no one, except maybe me on the introvert spectrum, no one's at the end of either spectrum, but it's just easy to talk about what the end points are so that everyone else is somewhere in the middle. So as I work with people, we talk about moderate preference, strong preference, and or very mild preference. So they're really just somewhere along a spectrum. And none of them are predictive of success. They just aren't relevant. They're not related to ambition. They're not related to career success. They're just not those type of categories. So, and the last thing I'll say is we're highly adaptive to context and expectations. And what I mean by that is both just things like if I'm tired, I behave differently and I express some of my preferences differently than if I've had a good night's sleep. If I'm really busy, I express and some of my preferences show up differently than when I'm, more relaxed and have time to work through things. If I'm in a different context, if I'm at a football game or if I'm at a parent-teacher conference, at a small gathering, at a small one-on-one kind of thing, I behave differently. My behaviors look differently. Doesn't mean my preferences change. It just means that I've learned how to adapt to those situations. So. All right, that's the background. Now let me actually get into what this thing is. So there's four what the Myers-Briggs people call dichotomies. I sometimes generalize it and just call them dimensions. And the first three are the stuff that comes out of Jung's research. Jung's life's work, actually, not just his research. So you're probably familiar and most familiar with the first one, right? So what stimulates you? What gives you energy? That's the introvert extrovert spectrum, or the IE spectrum. And we all have a preference somewhere along this spectrum. So that's also just getting back to whether this test is valid. You have preferences in each of these three categories. You have a preference for taking in energy. You have a preference for taking in information, and you have a preference for taking in decisions or making decisions. So I don't understand this, is it valid question? Yeah, because you have preferences and we're just going to talk about what they are. So anyway, so those are the three. There's what Jung called an orientation, and then two functions. So the first function is how you take in information. Since it's about taking information, it's called perceiving. It's not necessarily the best choice of words, but it's what was attached to it in the 40s, and we're stuck with it ever since. And the two ends of the spectrum are people who perceive through their senses, which is S, and people who perceive through intuition. And since the I was already taken, we had to use the N. So it's the S versus N spectrum, or the S versus N dichotomy. And the second function is how do you make decisions? And this is also a terrible choice of words because Jung called it judging, and that has nothing to do with the modern sense of the word judging. It does not mean anything about being judgmental. It has to do with how you make decisions. And on one end of the spectrum, you make decisions based on relationships and people and harmony in those relationships. And Jung called that the feeling end of the spectrum. Also a terrible choice of words because it makes it sound emotional and it makes it sound touchy-feely, and it's not really that. It's just that you prioritize and have a stronger preference for the relationship and the harmony, especially in those relationships. And so that's called the F, or the feeling end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum, which I tend to fall on, although I'm fairly moderate here, I bounce between the two, is they call it thinking. And that also is not a good choice of words because it doesn't mean that Fs don't think, and it doesn't mean that thinkers don't feel. It simply is that you make your decisions based on logic and analysis and analyzing the situation and kind of deduction versus focusing on how relationships or people. So and then Myers and Briggs came along and said, well, these three are great, but they've also noticed one other aspect of it. So let me say this. So you've got this orientation, which we all have somewhere in that spectrum, and you've got these two functions. And Jung pointed out that one of these functions will be primary for you and one will be secondary. So just because your primary function may be one doesn't mean the other one's zero. It just means that it's secondary for you, and it may be a close secondary, right? What Myers and Briggs noticed along the way is there's also another way that we play with these functions. Not only is one stronger than the other for us, but there's also one that which we kind of combine with number one there, and we orient outwards. And there's the other one we orient inwards. So there's sense of which of these two do you orient to the outside world and which do you orient to the inside world. If you orient, like this is where it gets kind of wonky. So if you orient your perceiving function to the outside world, then you're called a perceiver. And or a P, and if you orient your judging function to the outside world, then you're called the judge, a J. So hence you get these various combinations. So I have a very strong preference for I, a preference for intuition, a preference for thinking, and I have a preference for orienting my judging to the outside world. So I'm an INTJ. My partner is an ENTJ. right? And so we're very similar, except she gets her energy externally, I get it internally. Otherwise, we kind of process information and make decisions similarly. So that's the 4 functions. I'm going to spend the rest of the next 30 minutes or so just kind of going into more detail on what they are, and then we'll do some Q&A. Are you with me so far?
Yep.
Yay. Okay. So let's do the IE spectrum first, because I think this one is the most profound. If I only had time for one, it would be this one. I think that this is the one that causes the most havoc and a lot of the most dysfunction in our organizations, a lot of times our families, and definitely our classrooms, because we don't understand the difference between these 2 sets of preferences and how people think and how they interact with the world. Jung called this, and I'll kind of break this down with 3 different ways of describing it before I go into detail and kind of how it manifests. So Jung called this the orientation to the world. And I think that's actually still pretty profound to this day. It's very good. So I have a strong preference for introversion. So my orientation to the world is inward. I just think inward first. The world starts inward for me. And then when I'm kind of comfortable in that inward space, I open my eyes, I look up, and I encounter the outside world, but it starts inward. Other people start external. So they have an orientation, and I say my partner's an extrovert. So her orientation is to the outside world. She starts with an external orientation. And she can think and write and do everything I can do. She just starts with the orientation externally and then brings it inward. I start with the orientation inward, and sometimes, but not always, bring it out. So that's the Jungian sense of it. It's still pretty valid. So you often hear people talk about, where do you get your energy, right? So extroverts like to be around other people because that gives them energy, because they're getting energy from the external world. You think introverts like to be alone? That's not necessarily true. Introverts just get their energy from their inside. So if I'm in a conversation, a book club, a deep discussion with someone, there can be 2 other, 3 other people in that conversation. And that's very stimulating to me, right? But the stimulation is still coming from the inside because we're having these deep conversations. Susan Cain wrote a fabulous book on this called The Power of Introverts The Power of Introverts in a World That Won't Stop Talking. She hit it big with a TED Talk, and then has since done really well with that book. Now, this stuff has been around since the 40s, but somehow Susan Cain became the tipping point for this. So suddenly it was okay to be an introvert in our society. And suddenly people started talking about this in a way that wasn't stigmatizing. So I really credit her with that. And she uses the word stimulation a lot. And I like that better than as a source of energy. So I think a lot about what stimulates me. And this is especially important if I'm running low on energy. So if I'm really feeling down and I know I'm low energy, I know that I can quickly step off and step aside for 30 minutes and read an essay or listen to a podcast, of which I listen to a lot of because of this kind of thing, because it just stimulates the heck out of me. Now, if you're an extrovert, you may decide that you're going to run to a coffee shop or take a walk through, downtown, just because you need that external stimulation. But that sense of what stimulates you is really powerful, actually. And it's interesting, too, that you'll hear people who, well, here's an example. So you've got a big project to work on, right? Suppose we're working on some kind of big research. You're in college and you've got a paper due. So the introvert will say to their roommate, I've really got this big paper to do. Do you mind if I turn the radio off? Because I need it quiet. Because if that outside radio's on, that's really distracting to me, and it's actually using energy from me. I need all of my energy focused internally to work on that paper. An extrovert will say exactly the opposite. Man, I've got this big paper to do. Do you work to finish? Do you mind if I turn the radio on? And what's interesting about that is, with the radio on, it not only doesn't distract them, but if they're assuming they're not listening to like lyrics or whatever, something distracting, but not most of the time people, extroverts can play instrumental or soft music in the background, but the external stimulation itself is giving them energy. They need it, right? So there's that sense of where the energy is actually coming from the outside. And so what's relevant to this is you need to know where you are in the spectrum, so that if you're feeling low on energy, you can just go to whatever side that is that works for you. Okay. So those are the kind of the 2 that have been kind of drifting about in society for the last 10, 20 or 50 years, whatever. I have added one. It's not necessarily original, but it's one that I really champion, because I think this is the heart of the introvert extrovert spectrum. And that is where you think. because we both think in very different places. And that is kind of strange words to talk about thinking, because we don't think about thinking as occurring in a place, but it absolutely does. And it works like this. Because introverts have an orientation inward, we need to have our thoughts more fully formed before we ever verbalize them. In fact, we often have no need to ever verbalize them. So if you have an introvert in your life, I guarantee they've got a head full of ideas that have never made it out because nobody's bothered to ask, and they've really had no need to say so. So introverts need to have their thoughts more fully formed before they speak them. Extroverts, and this is at the extremes, no one's quite at this extreme, but just speaking at the broadest generalities, extroverts need to verbalize their thoughts to form them. That is actually the thought process for them. And I'll give you kind of a comical example that popped up for me probably about 10 years after I met my partner. We were sitting at a restaurant, one of our favorite little pizza places in Durham, North Carolina. We've been there before. We sat down, we're looking at the menu, and I'm kind of quietly looking over, deciding what I want. But a minute later, 2 minutes later, my partner says, "What do I want?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't know. Do what I did. Read the menu," right? And then it dawned on me, she had to verbalize that thought to think it. What do I want? Right? She wasn't asking me to tell her what to get. She was verbalizing the thought so she could think it, so she could figure out what is it that I want to have off the menu. And so that's kind of the difference. So this idea of brainstorming is an extrovert's heaven and an introvert's hell, right? Because an introvert, when somebody else is talking, I'm not thinking. I need to go away and think. And I know you guys have seen this before. It may have been a long time ago, but I have a few examples here that really resonate with people, and they certainly resonate with me. I want you to think back, and it may have been a long time ago, but think back to a time when you were sitting in a classroom and the teacher starts asking a question. And about halfway through, about half of the kids in the class are like, oh, pick me. I know. And I'm sitting in the back of the room, and I was literally in my 40s in a graduate level class, an MBA class at Berkeley, when I finally realized this. The teacher was actually had part of our grade was class participation, and she was grading people based on who put their hands up. And I'm sitting in the back of the room thinking, well, I am participating. I'm not talking, but I'm thinking. I mean, you can't count. Anyway, I got to get back to my example. So the teacher asks the question, halfway through, half of the people have raised their hand, and I'm thinking, how did they know? How do they know what they're going to say? I need time to think about it. And I finally figured out, as I learned this Myers-Briggs stuff, they didn't know what they were going to say. But they had enough confidence in their abilities that if the teacher picked them, the process of verbalizing it would allow them to form the thought and answer the question. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That they wanted that, oh, pick me. I'd love the chance to think this, right? And I'm sitting in the back saying, will you please shut up? I'm trying to think, right? So just the difference. And if you have kids or nieces or nephews or grandchildren, they really need to understand this. And so do their teachers, because the introverts are participating. They're thinking. And for God's sakes, don't judge class participation by the person who raises their hand and answers first. I'll give another example too. One of my favorites, when I lived in the UK for a couple of years, and I worked for probably the best boss I ever had. His name was Kenny. We were working for the pensions department of the British government, and we were doing this massive transformation of the way they handled their IT. And so he was heading it all. I was heading up the projects team, and there was 3 or 4 other teams that reported to him. And we would have these constant big, what are we going to do about this? Where does this go? What do we do with these 50 people over here? Well, how do we do? And conversing with Kenny, he was as extroverted a person as I ever knew. And when you were talking with him, it was almost like a cartoon drawing. You could almost see the thought bubbles just forming in front of his face. The ideas were just forming and pouring and forming. And I would like stand there and just like, go, man, go, right? And you can contribute a little bit. And then I would reach a point where you're like, Kenny, I've got a lot to add here. And I'll be back in 2 hours to tell you what it is, right? Or he'd ask me a question about something, but like, Kenny, I've got a good answer for you, and I'll be back in the morning to tell you what it is. And he was savvy enough to know that we had this 2 difference in preferences. And so we would have these discussions, and he would go off, and then he'd like, okay, go away, and then come back tomorrow and tell me what you think. And so that dynamic is optimal. And if you've ever worked in teams, and if you've ever managed, or you know people who manage teams, that's the way you want to manage it. Give everybody a chance to talk about it. Give the extroverts a chance to think it through. Give the introverts a chance to kind of digest what it is you're talking about, and then send the introverts away and ask them to come back tomorrow or a couple of days and say, okay, now what do you think? Because that's the way their brains work. It's not a deficiency. It's simply the way their brains work. So not surprisingly, introverts prefer email, extroverts prefer telephone. So I was joking at the earlier, right? I have an article clip somewhere of some CEO who's like so fed up with email. This is like banning all email on Fridays. Great. That's great for you. You're probably an extrovert. If you ring me without telling me in advance you're going to call me, I'm not going to answer because I don't know what I'm going to say. So text me first and tell me you're going to call me in 5 minutes, and then I'll be okay. So anyway, so that's kind of the two main, or that's the way I think the where you think is the most important part. And you probably already know now, we don't need an assessment to decide where you fall. You can tell already just from the babbling I've been doing for the last 5-10 minutes where you fall on the introvert extrovert spectrum. How many introverts think they're in the room? John, yeah. John, I would question that though. Jim, I can see that in you. John, you tend to verbalize to express your thoughts sometimes. No? I would have pegged you as more of a preference for extrovert.
I've done the MBTI twice, but about 25 years ago. And on the first one, I was 90% I. On the second one, 95%. And that's like a lifetime away.
Well, you've learned then because you're very comfortable conversing with the group. Maybe it's because you know us well. So that's cool. That's interesting. Okay. Sherry, you have a preference for extroversion, right?
Completely, all my life.
Cool. Hey, Leo, welcome. I think Leo has a preference for extroversion too. I don't know how long you've been here or what you heard.
He just came in.
Okay.
I joined at 7:01.
Dang. You'll have to catch the first half of the video. Let me keep going though. So here's kind of some of the specifics of the difference between introversion and extroversion. So an introversion is introvert is oriented towards ideas, inwardly on ideas and concepts. Like I was saying, we need to think to talk. We have to think first before we can talk. And oftentimes we don't bother talking because we don't need to, I have no real need to verbalize most of the things I'm saying. They just sit and percolate there nicely. We need internal stimulation to gain energy. We like quiet for concentration. Written is way better than verbal communication. So and the weird thing here is, I can have a 3-sentence email and it can take me a damn half hour to write it. It just that writing process, that internalized thinking, writing, it takes me a long time. So our learning styles are relevant here. And this actually came up really prominent for me. I was working with a coaching client who was very extroverted in a company that was predominantly introverted, and their learning styles really conflicted. And so they were really having second thoughts about hiring her because they thought she wasn't qualified and stuff. And it was really just a matter of learning styles being very different. So I know my learning style: reading, studying, reflection, mental practice, all fantastic for me. I'm not a very good experiential learner. If you put me in some kind of group or put me through some exercise, it freaks me out, makes me nervous, and I shut down. I don't learn. Give me the book or demonstrate it for me and I'll watch. I'll probably get it. You may want me to try it anyway, but I almost don't need to most of the time because I can just get it by studying and watching what you do. I like this idea that introverts need to understand life to experience it. So if I'm going on a vacation somewhere, if I want to have a particularly good time, I have to study up about the place before I go. If I don't understand that place, I won't experience it in near the same way. And this has nothing to do with shyness. So there's often a conflation of, introverts are shy. Shyness is a social, it's a fear, a fear of social awkwardness. It's really just a lack of social skills. And once you buff up on those social skills, the shyness goes away. I used to be really shy because I was really socially awkward. I'm still not so great on it, but I just don't care anymore. But social skills and a preference for introversion are two completely different things and should not be conflated. So now I'm kind of mapping these across one-to-one. Extroverts are just oriented outwards, and they're oriented towards people and things. They have to talk to think. They definitely prefer with others if they need or want energy. They like lots of variety. They like action-oriented things because, again, all that's externally stimulating, right? They prefer face-to-face communications. They won't hesitate to pick up the phone. I've got a friend, kind of a neighbor of his, become a friend, and we haven't had a chance to talk about this, but he'll pick up the phone on a heartbeat and just call me. And I'm like, dude, you just can't call me. You just can't. I mean, you got to give me a warning first. Set a time, go to my calendar, set an appointment. You can't just call me, man. So he prefers to just pick up the phone. They definitely are more inclined to learn by doing. They'll learn in groups. They'll talk with others, right? This is an issue also in schools, right? We think that kids have to be put in groups to learn. And so we'll put them in groups and force them. And a lot of times you're torturing the introverts on that. Introverts learn very well by thinking, studying, listening, watching. Some skills, of course, have to be practiced to be mastered, but it's not near as much doing as most people think. So. And extroverts need to experience life to understand it. So they're the ones who just dive right in and then kind of decipher and process what they're seeing. And so the contrast on this side is gregariousness or outgoingness even is not extroversion, right? I know people who are gregarious, who are, work as a clerk in a store or whatever. It's a skill you learn. Being gregarious, being outgoing, being social is a skill. It's a social skill. Whether or not that's giving you energy. This is, examples, flight attendants, right? Flight attendants have to be gregarious and outgoing. Half of them probably have a preference for introversion. It's just something they've learned to do for their job, right? They can do it. And then I'll throw this up there because I think it's great. I talked earlier about it's not predictive of skills, of career skills. And this is kind of my favorite category of professional is actors, because they span the spectrum, right? Johnny Carson, if you watch some of his he was have very strong preference for introversion. And if you read any of his biography, he was very quiet, very personal, left the stage. Jay Leno took the same job, filled it completely differently. Jay Leno was very clear to me, have strong preference for extroversion. You can be president of the United States as an introvert. You can be president as an extrovert. Can be Meryl Streep, brilliant introverted actor. I think Whoopi Goldberg, brilliant, but clearly very extroverted. Bill Murray, Billy Crystal, introvert versus extrovert. You can do the job. Now, granted, Whoopi Goldberg is a very different actress than Meryl Streep, but they're both very good actresses. They have just manifested and become good at it in their own way. Okay, that's the introvert extrovert spectrum. I think that's one of the most important. And if you take nothing away tonight, but start looking at your friends, at your family, your spouse, your children, and really get a sense of where they are on the spectrum and try to then understand the implications of that. And I have a cheat sheet I can make available to you afterwards if you want that goes into much more detail on this and kind of ways they engage with the world and the way they make decisions and the way they handle stress and all that kind of stuff. So. Okay, I got 3 more functions to go to. I'm going to do those much quicker. So I'm just going to kind of breeze through these. So if you remember that there was an orientation, introvert versus extrovert, then there was 2 functions. This first function is the sensing versus intuition function. This is the how do you take in information? We all take in information. The question is, do we take it in through our senses or do we take it in through intuition? And that sounds like, well, even if you take it in through intuition, you got to start somewhere. So you have some senses, sensory input, I suppose. But you don't need a whole lot. And people like Einstein are an example of, they created these incredible theories that we're still proving. And very little of it was based on sensory information. It was all based on intuition. So anyway, here's a rundown of the 2. A sensing person is one who trusts, who relies on, who puts priority on their senses, right? Sight, taste, touch, whatever. Facts, details, experience, the present and the past, because it's history and we can look back and see what it was. That's a priority for a sensing person. They trust and they depend on their 5 senses. That is valid truth for them. Facts, details, precision, right? These make great accountants, great PhD researchers, great whatever, because they're doing data collection, they're doing facts and details. They tend to be very present oriented, so the present, the current is important to them because that's where their senses are, that's where they are. They're strong believers in what works because their senses tell them this works, and so they find that validating. They prefer using learned skills versus stretching and challenging to learn something new. They're patient with details. They rely on standard solutions, what's worked in the past, right? If you're trying to sell something to a sensing person, you're going to give them examples of people who've been successful with this, or projects that have used this product in the past. You're going to give them satisfied customers because that's data, that's proof that it's worked for others. And they need to work through a problem to see the result. They see the trees, they sometimes miss the forest. And the intuitive is the opposite of that in some ways, right? Their brain works in symbols and theories and frameworks, models. They tend to think about the future. So I'm very strong. I'm kind of pegged on the introverted side, and I'm also pegged on the intuition side of this. So it's been a struggle for me at times, actually. You give me a piece of data and I will begin to form a model around that and kind of create a theory and a mental framework about it. Give me another piece of data and I'm like, yep, that fits my model. And then I'll be like, stop, I don't want any more, right? Because you'll mess up my model. So I've already got this figured out. Don't tell me anymore, right? So we synthesize things. We in fact mistrust our senses. And I'll give you an example in a minute of kind of a comical one, how I don't trust my senses. I've seen things that weren't there, and I've not seen things that were there. I've heard things that I've misheard things. So I really mistrust my senses here. We tend to bring things into awareness around connecting dots. We look at big pictures, right? We try to understand the connections and relations between things. We are very happy with, well, I know that's the way it was, but what could it be, right? Let's blue sky this. Let's think about the future. Let's project this forward. And I've gone into teams, and I was a manager for 25 years. And you'd get into teams and it's like, well, that's just not how it's done around here. We're like, I don't care how it's done around here. Let's do it right. Let's do it better. Let's take the team forward. And that's just me falling on my intuition and not respecting the fact that I probably had some sensing people on my teams. I'm always willing to add a new skill. I love that stretch. So intuitive people tend to stretch themselves. I'm happy being mediocre at lots of things, so that's fine. Very impatient with routine details. I run my own small business now, and the days that I have to do accounting just about kill me. So QuickBooks is like torture for me. I have a whole set of rituals around that make it possible for me to actually do my accounting. I very much don't do like the same thing repeatedly. Routine is, I'm constantly mixing it up. Even when I used to do this, when I used to commute a lot, I would take different routes just because I know it's longer, but I just want to try it. And maybe I'll discover some secret alleyway that I never knew existed. Intuitives tend to see the result first. We kind of visualize a result and then work our way towards it with kind of collecting data to find the solution. And we have that's the wrong size font. Sorry about that. I'm not trying to overemphasize that. We tend to see the forest and often miss the trees, to our detriment, by the way. So neither of these has a greater value with one or the other. My intuition blinds me to information. And when I'm building a team, I have to make sure that I have at least one other person on that team who can complement my gap, because I have blinding gaps around data and collecting valid information. And so absolutely, there's no value judgment here. It's simply a set of preferences. From what I've said, how many people think they fall on the sensing side of the spectrum here? Sensing or intuition? How many intuitives? Sherry's intuitive. John, Jim?
I'm not sure.
One resonate? And you can be very mild preference either way. That's a wonderful gift, actually. If you can go back and forth, I think that's the only way to get a PhD, because a PhD really requires lots of detailed research. And then you kind of got to connect some dots and create something new out of it. So you got to kind of move between the two. So yeah, curious. It's fine to be right in the middle. It's a very good one. I studied medieval philosophy for a while, and I had to crack up because I studied that before I studied the Myers-Briggs. And when I got to the Myers-Briggs, I'm like, holy crap, this stuff's been around for a long time. So anyone who has studied medieval philosophy, if you remember around the 15th, 16th, 17th century, maybe, there was this whole debate around what empiricism versus rationalism. And empiricism, which was spearheaded by John Locke, was this adamant, we were born tabula rasa, we're a blank slate, we're nothing. And all of our knowledge comes from observations and experiences. And reality exists out there, but we can only know what we take in through our senses, right? That is just us. That is just sensing on the Myers-Briggs right out of the textbooks. And the other half, and this was, raging debate for a century in medieval philosophy, was rationalism. It's primarily associated with Descartes. that sometimes my senses deceive me. And this is kind of Descartes' famous deductive argument, right? I don't even know if I can trust my senses. I don't even know if what I saw is true. In fact, he says, how do I know if I even exist? And then he says, well, wait a minute, I'm thinking. So there must be something around to exist. So therefore I think, therefore I am. So he was clearly a very strong preference for intuition because he did not trust his senses. And so the empiricism versus rationalism to me is just an S versus N debate. And Descartes was that reality exists inside our minds. We can't know for sure what's out there. We can't trust our senses. We can't know. All we know is the reality that our intuition creates inside our minds. So now a couple of examples that I find rather fun here because they really do illustrate the difference between the sensing preference and the intuitive preference. And by the way, the balance here, most of the other three functions, the other three categories, society is split pretty evenly 50-50. One of them's 40-60, but the other two are 50-50. This one is really skewed. About 75% of the population has a preference for sensing, and only about 25% has a preference for intuition. So the intuitives are relatively rare, 1 in 4. But let me give you some examples. So a sleight of hand, a street magician takes the 3-card, was it the 3-card, makes something disappear, right? Now, how would these two different preferences process that? Well, a sensing person is going to say, where did it go? Right? Because, no, I got that wrong. Yeah, the sensing person is going to say, where did it go? Because it was there a minute ago and now it's not. And an intuitive person is going to say, well, I know it didn't disappear. It's a physical object and you can't make physical objects completely disappear. They just simply tricked me into thinking that it's gone. So my first question is, how did he do that? Right? So that sense of it was there and now it's gone, kind of object permanence, where did it go? Versus, come on, I know it didn't disappear. So you see how I've taken a sensory input and abstracted it 2 more levels to come on, it couldn't have disappeared. It's got to be somewhere. It's up his sleeve or down his pants or whatever. How did he do that? So sensing versus intuition. Einstein is jumping next. The idea of Einstein's theories of relativity and the special theory of relativity, all of those were done with what he called thought experiments. Absolutely 100% intuition, amazing intuition, right? And we're still running experiments to validate his theories, what, 100 years later? Yes, 100 years later. I find conspiracy theories really interesting in the sensing versus intuition category. Now, prior to the internet, or I should say prior to the misinformation age, conspiracy theories were wholly the domain of the intuitives, right? There was no way that a lone gunman shot at JFK. There was just, right? So that's an intuitive, like there has to be, there's no, so they're doing thought experiments. They're thinking this through. They're connecting dots that may or may not be connected. Until the age of the internet, conspiracy theories were wholly the domain of intuitives. In fact, they used to just make me laugh because you'd see them and you just realize that, man, somebody's really stretching to connect some dots there. Now that we have all this information readily at our hands and so many people are willing to put up completely false information on websites that look official or TV channels that sound official, it's now flipped. So now in our general culture, we have so much information and so much data and so many reports that the S's are taking in this information and they're being like, holy crap, look at this, look at this, look at this. And they're collecting data. Unfortunately, it's misinformation and it's false data, but you're not going to convince them of that. So they've got reference point to it, right? And you'll see people say, I saw the post this morning. I saw it on Facebook. That's an S telling you that they're validating. So it's really shifted now. And the world of misinformation has made 75% of the people more vulnerable to conspiracy theories now. I think in some degree and very mildly to some degree, you could say the climate debate is an S versus N debate. So the S's are like, well, the climate has always fluctuated. If you look back through history, there's been cold periods and hot periods, and we've had hurricanes and floods in the past and yada, yada, right? That's an S saying, look at the history, look at the past, look at the data. And an intuitive says, yeah, but look at all the carbon we've pumped into the atmosphere. That can't be good. We haven't hit 1.5 degree rise in temperature, but we're going to. It's going to be X years in the future. And so that's an N, trying to intuiting and connecting dots and processing forward. Neither of them are helpful in this situation. We've got to do something, and probably soon, but it's one way of understanding the climate debate. I don't really have time to go into Google versus Apple, but it's really an interesting one. The difference between Sergey Brin and the other guy who founded Google, and Steve Jobs, who founded Apple. Apple's deeply intuitive. Google is very, very sensing. It shows up in the way they run their companies, and it shows up in their products. And I think, and I'll skip this too, but I think to some degree you could argue that the Republican versus Democrat difference has an S versus N development in it, element to it. That the past tradition, the way it is, the way it always has been, versus the way it could be, the way it should be, is in some ways a very simplistic Republican versus Democrat split, but it's and a sensing versus intuition. So. Okay, 2 more categories, and this is the second major function. So now we've got, what's your orientation, inward or outward? How do you take in information through your senses or through intuition? And then this is the last big one, and then the fourth one is kind of which of the previous two do we tend to prioritize, but is how do you make decisions? How do you then take that information that you've processed, that you've either through intuition or sensing, however you've got that information, then how do you make a decision, right? And the ways to think of this are, do you make decisions based on logic, or do you make decisions based on harmony? Right? Kind of, if you're thinking in the legal sphere, is it more important to have justice, or is it more important to have mercy? And that's the thinking versus feeling. And I said earlier that these are bad words now, because in the 21st century, they don't mean what Jung meant by them. So think more of, instead of thinking versus feeling, it's really logic versus harmony. Do you make decisions by just deducing the logic, or do you make decisions by, well, yeah, I know, but this is going to affect this person. I don't want to lose, that's a long-term customer, and I don't want to lose them. So I'm willing to take a, whatever. So here's the two sides: the thinking person, the logic person, logic. They tend to be objective and impersonal, right? Because it's just logic. It's nothing personal, right? We focus on accuracy, correctness, internal consistency, really important. I have a mild preference here for thinking. I'm not really strong on this. We're definitely maybe have a moderate preference here. I can be pretty strong. And I've really nurtured the other side in the last 2 decades of my life. Concerned with objective truth. We see the world based on principles of fairness and standards. We're fair-minded for sure, but fair-minded in an objective sense. And because of that, we can often be perceived as insensitive or cool. My partner and I, who is also a strong T, actually, we talk about turning up our F, to warming things up. We'll write an email and then we'll come back and add some F to it later because it's just too insensitive or too cool, too objective.
Was that fair-minded or firm-minded?
Oh, firm-minded, sorry. Yeah, we tend to be very firm-minded because it's based on logic. So you can't argue with that, right? So we'll just make our decisions based on logic, and the analysis is sound. And so I can be pretty firm-minded. Good catch. Thank you, Jim. And the flip side to that is that you make decisions based on relationships, that they're more subjective and life is more personal. You focus on values, likes and dislikes. You're concerned with relationships and harmony. You see the world as personalized and connected. You're sympathetic to others' views. You often can be perceived as too sensitive, and mercy is more important than justice, right? So a 17-year-old shoplifts, does something really stupid, and ends up in front of a judge. On one hand, you could say you broke the law. You're going to jail. You're going to serve your time. On the other hand, you could say the kid's 17 years old. Don't ruin your life over this. Give him another chance, right? Show some mercy. T versus F, right? This is actually cultural. America tends to, so America as a whole, all of these things, by the way, apply as much to groups and organizations as they do to individuals. So I would say that America has a very strong preference for extroversion overall, even though the population is still 50-50. I lived in the UK for a couple of years, and it was exactly the opposite. As a country, the UK has a fairly strong preference for introversion. You'll hear phrases like, gotta have a think, noodle that, go have a think about it and come back. It's totally normal there, even though the population is also about 50-50 split. America also has a strong preference for T, and I've not lived or worked in Japan, but I have a sense that Japan would be the counterexample here, that working with people in Japan, they have a stronger preference for relationships, that unless you have a good relationship with those people, you're never going to sell them your product, right? That the relationship comes first. We'll maintain that over the long term, and the harmony of this relationship is more important than any single product or any single sale. Okay, that's the three main categories. So the last thing I'll do, and I really don't have time because this stuff gets kind of nuanced and weird, but the last category is simply which of the previous two, you're taking in information or your decision-making, do you show to the outside world? And that becomes what they call the perceiving versus judging function, right? Again, both kind of bad choices of words, especially judging, but we all have a preference for which we orient to the outside world. Remember also, we also have one of those is our primary function and one is secondary. And this gets really fun if you extrovert your secondary function and introvert your primary function, which is what I do. Because I look more confident than I am is what happens. Anyway, so if you extrovert your perceiving function, then you want to take in more information, right? You're not ready to make a decision yet. It's more important for you to make a decision. So decisions are deferred to the last minute. If you're going on a vacation, you're probably not going to plan for it because you might find something even better once you get there, because once you get more information, then you'll know more and then you'll be, so a person who orients a P, right, that orients their taking in information is going to be perceived as less decisive, right? Alternatively, a judging person is willing to make a decision. I used to tell people, I'm totally willing to change my mind, but today I'm making a decision, so let's move on. That's a J, right? That's a judging person. I may be wrong. I'm open to more information, right? That's it. Actually, I'm open to more sensing information, but for now I'm ready to decide and move on. Let me just give you the two lists here so you can see them both too. So perceiving likes it flexible, likes open, spontaneous, hates schedules, doesn't like rigid procedures. They can appear pretty casual and easygoing. They're always open to new information. They adapt to changing situations. They may seem and freak out J's because they look disorganized and messy and often sometimes even considered irresponsible. Not the case. They just are, they look that way. They can be very organized. They just don't externalize that. They don't show the world that organization. The judging function is structure, order, predictability, hate loose ends. I'm willing to make a decision and come back and clean it up later, than have a loose end of something being undecided. Got to have a plan. Your best project managers in the world are J's. We appear very systematic, orderly. We can seem pretty uptight to P's. I'm like, they can just be like, you're so rigid, man. Just calm down. We can decide this when we get there, right? I skipped those last two. And then this last one, I discovered this maybe relatively recent in my Myers-Briggs journey, how they behave differently under pressure. And it has to do with when our bodies release endorphins and when it releases cortisol. And it is exactly opposite. So this is not one that you can just talk yourself out of, right? If you have a preference for perceiving, then planning is very stressful for you. And kind of taking it, planning is stressful and pressure is pleasurable, right? You kind of enjoy that last minute rush. So anyone who's done, pulled an all-nighter is most likely a P, or actually been overloaded, but most likely a P. I've never pulled an all-nighter, and I have 12 years of post-high school education. I never pulled an all-nighter. I was always prepared for my exams. I was always, well in advance, because I have a strong preference for J here. And I would find an all-nighter just way too stressful. I'd have way too much cortisol in my blood, my blood to do that. So I find pressure stressful and I find planning pleasurable. And P's are just exactly the opposite. So it's not even a matter of, oh, come on, just, go ahead and put a plan together. When I'm coaching people, this is one of the ones I need to know first, because I have a strong preference for planning. I'm a J. And if I'm coaching a P, none of the stuff that's worked for me is going to work for you. And so I have to completely rethink about this from your perspective. And I tend to focus more with P's on momentum. Let's just get started. Let's get the ball rolling. Once we get some momentum, we'll keep it rolling. Totally valid. Would drive me nuts. Works like a charm for a P, right? So this is also why I find the Myers-Briggs helpful in just understanding other people. If I'm talking to someone who's a P and I start yakking about, well, here's what I did, you should just do what I do. And they're like, wah, 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 because it's just not only is it not registering, it's raising their cortisol levels if I tell them to do what I do, right? All right, I'm out of time. The split, like I said, is almost 50-50, except for the sensing intuition there, the blue ones, second, third and fourth ones. That one's really surprising to me, that almost 3/4 of the population is sensing. And if you take all of these different possible combinations, you get 16. If I was a screenwriter or a novelist, if you are a screenwriter or novelist, put these up on a dartboard and shoot darts at them, and there's your characters. Look up their personality profiles, and you have these wonderful, contrasting, conflicting personality types that just see the world differently, and it makes for great dramatic tension. So it also makes for important differences in relationships. I have some data on the differences between the managers and general population too, but no time to go into that today. All right, I'm done. It's 7:30, so the Jeopardy crowd can step off. Any other, I'm stick around for a while if you have questions or comments.
I loved it.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Isn't it? That's why I like it. It's just interesting. Yeah, thank you.
I
What was
prefer
interesting?
emails.
Do you? There you go.
I prefer
Do you-
emails rather than talking in person.
Mhm.
Do you have a sense of what every one of us is based on having studied this so long?
Well, yeah, I pegged you as an extrovert. Leo's an extrovert. I was wrong on John. I thought John was so, and Jim, I think pretty easily agree you're an introvert. Now, what about S versus
Sure am.
N? Sherry, you're pretty artistic, so I would say that tends to be artist, but not necessarily, but possibility. Yeah, I'm not gonna.
I'm an intuitive one. I already know.
You are?
that. Yeah,
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Yeah, you're an intuitive.
yeah.
I don't know.
My introversion it can be kind of humorous sometimes. Whenever I have to speak in front of a large crowd, my voice starts getting real high pitched. My ears start turning red. So it can be humorous sometimes,
Yeah.
but it's
Although that's partially just experience, right? Because I love public speaking, and people say, "Really?" And you're an
not
introvert.
me.
They are very different, right?
Yeah, I
So in
don't like
fact,
it at all. yeah.
but public speaking is a set of skills that for some reason I like. I was a teacher for a while, so it's just an extension of teaching, I guess, for me. But I speak very differently than an extrovert speaks. I can't do extemporaneous. I was in Toastmasters for a while, and I had to quit because they kept doing those table topic things where they would force you to stand up and talk about something for 2 minutes. They would just throw something at you and make you talk about it. That literally, like, I would just be a deer in the headlights. I can't do that. But if you let me prepare a speech, which I will prepare 40 frickin' hours for, I'll deliver a great speech, right? Pre-think my thoughts, pre-form them, and then develop the skills over the years to actually present them. But the presentation skills are really separate, and introverts can learn to present well, and I think make some great speakers because they put so damn much thought in it in advance. Extroverts are better at motivational speaking. They're really more, in the moment, impromptu and inspirational. They're good at that. I'm not so good at that because I'm already figured out what I'm going to say in advance, and I'm just going to kind of run through my talk when I get there. Got to go, Jim. Thanks for
Yep.
coming.
Hi,
Okay,
Jim.
thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Heather. It was great.
Awesome. John, Sherry, you're an I and what else? I
I'm
take
an
you as a,
ENTJ. I think that's how I
Yeah.
always tested. It seems like one time I tested, and I think I might have been an ENTP,
yeah,
but that was just one out of many times because we've done this a lot. We've done the disc one at work, and I've done is it Enneagram?
yes.
I've done that
Yeah.
one just on my own with a group that was doing it. I just find it really interesting because I really like understanding people.
Mhm, mhm.
And like even for this group, when we first started, we had a big group, and I knew some people were introverted, and we had, well, John knows Jack, very extroverted and going to talk and tell you a lot of stuff. So that's why we started the book group as a round robin, where everybody had a chance to speak without interruption, because we had quite a few people that were introverted who would have never had a chance to speak.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting, and I was a manager, so I think it's interesting to understand your people.
Yeah.
And my husband, I would say, is an introverted, although he's learned to be extroverted. My daughter is introverted. My son is extroverted.
Yeah.
So we've got
Interesting.
2 and 2 here. And,
Yeah.
it's always surprising to me what my daughter feels uncomfortable doing, where I'm like, why? Let's just go. So,
What?
I mean, now I understand it, but when she was younger, it was like, what's the problem here? Let's just get out and do it.
Yeah.
So,
John, I'm going to guess, and you tell me which ones I'm wrong on, because I'm wrong on at least one. ISFP. Introversion, sensing, feeling, preference for relationships over logic, and perceiving. Not worried about getting the decision made, not a planner, not a project planner. No, none of, which one? All of them wrong?
I was INTJ most of my life,
Really? That's same
which
as
I
me.
understand is the 16th option for virtually all generals. And I went through a life crisis 25 years ago, I guess. Maybe, no, must have been more than that. Anyway, I dramatically reversed the F and T from T to F. So I'm an INFJ. Wait, INFT.
and did you do that?
INFJ.
INFJ.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you
I
do
see
that
that.
purposefully working towards that?
No,
No, just changed.
I changed partners and jobs and living environment and all kinds of stuff. But I have some questions.
Yeah.
Didn't the MBTI used to be called the Myers-Briggs Temperament Index?
Oh, it's a good question. It might have been. I don't know.
When
It's a good
When I
question.
got started with it 30, 40 years ago, or 30 years ago, maybe, I swear that was the name of it. I can accept the validity of the results of the MBTI, but I had to research the reliability because one of my master's degree counselors that I supervised asked for permission to use counsel. And at that time, this would have been early 2000s, that the reliability is close to 50%. That means you can get totally different results a couple days later, a week later, a month later, that the results are valid for that particular day and hour, but some other time in the future, chances are 50-50 to be very different.
So I definitely did not make myself clear. Let me try this one more time. The assessment is irrelevant to what your preferences are. The question of whether it's a valid assessment is an irrelevant assessment. So here's what I said, that it takes me 4 to 6 hours to go through this with people, because by the end of it, the person will have decided what their preferences seem to be in each of those 4 categories. I don't care what the results showed up on the assessment that you took. I don't care what I guessed for you and got wrong, right? Your Myers-Briggs preferences are what your preferences are in those 4 categories. To uncover those, I need to spend at least 4 to 6 hours with you to get at them, to explain them, to ask you questions, to give you exercises, to come back. I sometimes start with that assessment tool because it's a pretty good way then to just start and then go left or right on it. But I don't even do that anymore. They charge me $200 a year just to be able to administer the test, and $50 a test. And I just think it's not worth it. And I don't need it, because I still spend the same 6 hours with the person. And by the time I'm done, they can tell me my preference based on what we've said and what I've read and experienced. My preference is this for sensing, and I'm into it. And so that's what we're after. You decide. You've always decided. The fact that I have the ability to go, even if you do take an assessment and I can go back in and change it, is the point that it's your call on what your preferences are. And although you say yours changed, I mean, that doesn't actually fit the theory, because the theory says that your preferences are kind of default. We just adapt and learn to exercise different ones. So it's possible that prior to that, you were kind of off your preferences, or later you're off now, but you're finding this more functional for you. I don't know which one. I don't care either, but it's just, they're your preferences. You don't look back at an instrument. In fact, that's one of the reasons I've stopped using the instrument, because it misleads people into, I was labeled this type. I'm more interested in you expressively saying, these are my preferences. I
Yeah.
prefer to take in more information. I hate making decisions. I'm not going to do a project plan. It doesn't work for me, but I love mind maps. I've actually been getting into mind maps myself. Same kind of thing. Used to be a master of Microsoft Project. Now I'm kind of stretching beyond that to say, oh, mind maps are pretty cool. It's very fluid. I can move stuff around. That's more kind of me leaning into the other half of my preference. They're my preferences. I get to decide them. No assessment. It doesn't matter anymore. And that's how I've actually stopped using it.
Yeah,
I've
that makes-
taken it a lot of times, John, and it was only the one time, and I can't remember the instance that one thing was different, but I think in that one thing, I was always sort of close
Yeah, that's
there. And for whatever reason, the one time, but I mean, I've probably taken this 10, 15 times, and it's always been ENTJ except that once.
Let me also add that any of these free online things are completely bogus.
No, this was always
right?
through work. It was
Okay,
always
through a
work stuff.
practitioner. Good,
Yeah.
good, because those things drive me totally bonkers.
No.
But yeah,
It
if
This
it
was
through a-
always, someone like
Sure.
you doing it and then having days long, we were in meetings
Yeah,
and learning
yeah.
people's, personalities and.
Is there
That's
no
where
cor-
this really gets fun, is when you can put a team of people together and you start giving them scenarios and asking how to respond. And you'll separate them out, I versus E, and then you'll do another one that the S versus N's are separated. And it's stunning to see the different ways.
It was
people
amazing because we
process.
did
Yeah.
it for, I think we were using the disc one at this one particular time. And however, I don't remember all of that one because I haven't done that one as much, but however it panned out, the people that were working in the legal profession, myself included, were in one group and, kind of managing people in the legal. The people that were in the accounting department were all in one group. And ours was kind of different areas of the county, but that one was everybody from the accounting department was in that group. And we were all like, how did this happen? But part of it was, I can remember them having to go up on the whiteboard and do something. And I'm thinking, why are they doing it that way? This is so crazy. It doesn't make sense. We already know the answer to this. This is, but they were working through this problem,
Yeah.
like a math problem. And that was just how their brain worked. And that to me was a very incredible day to see that group so clearly defined because, I worked with them a lot, on budgeting and, stuff. And it just was like,
Yeah.
my
Yeah,
brain went,
interesting.
whoa, that totally makes sense why they're over there. Totally makes sense. They may have been thinking the same about me, but, for me, it was just like, I could have told you that. They had to be over there.
Mhm, mhm.
Heather, is there no correlation between the generic online versions and the real version?
I'm sure there's correlations. But they do a disservice, in my opinion. I mean, I'm so defensive of this idea that it's your preferences and you get to explore them and expose them, that what they do is completely invert that. They label it, they make it a test, and then they peg you with that. And it's just not it. It's just not. I mean,
How do they come up with those online versions?
who knows, right? Who knows? They ask you, would you rather be at home with a quiet evening or out with a party with your friends? Well, it depends. I mean, it
Mhm.
depends who the friends are and what night of the week it is, right? So they
Yeah, and
put
if you've
some
been out
bogus
every
questions-
night of the week before that, you might want to
Yeah.
stay home. So yeah.
Yeah.
And
Um,
how infrequent is it to totally switch on one of these dichotomies from one extreme to the other?
Well, like I
I-
say, this would be a fun exploration, but I just don't think anyone switches. Now, what they're reporting or behaving as, I mean, someone who met me as a child might think I've switched. I haven't. I've just learned to be more socially, on the introvert extrovert spectrum as an example, I've learned to be more socially skilled. I can extrovert, I can speak in public, I can, walk up to strangers. My preference hasn't changed. My underlying preference has been the same. So I would really have to explore. It's almost like a therapy session of why was it that you were either behaving that way before. Why I'd really have to understand because nobody switches, right? They learn to complement, they learn to stretch into the other dimensions. By the time people are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, they're pretty comfortable across the whole spectrum. They really learn. So when I'm working with a college grad, they're pretty set and they're not going anywhere. But by the time somebody's in their 50s and 60s, it's totally fine to push them out of there, because they've matured in their default zone, and so they start to move. So, but I shouldn't say that. They've learned to behave in the other, broader in the spectrum. The default anchor point hasn't changed, right? My default preferences are still my default preferences. I
Well, I
just
would
have
say,
more
like-
latitude to play in them.
Like my husband, I know is an introvert, hands down. Know it, always was.
Yeah.
But when he changed his position at work and he became a teacher, he had to become more extroverted.
Yeah.
He likes to tease, so that has to be verbally,
Yeah.
done. And because he lives with someone who's out and about and extroverted, he's got to
Pushes
come
him
along sometimes to things.
Yeah.
So people who don't know him might presume he is an extrovert, but he is not an extrovert at all. You know what I mean? If you look that way.
Heather, I don't understand how you can say people don't switch, because I was a social worker for 40 years, and I know that some people change their personality. I've changed my personality. I had a very structured civil service job, and I did it well. And the minute I retired, I cast that aside, and now it's like 100% unstructured life, 100% fine arts exploration. I never did that before. I
Have
feel
you
that
changed?
people
Have you
think-
changed how you take in information?
Yeah, I think so. Which dichotomy was
That's
that?
the sensing versus intuition.
Oh. Yeah, I guess I probably have, but I never took the index or MBTI before I was 40 or before I was 50. So I don't know.
There's
do
a
you
couple
think
other
there's-
possibilities.
Do you think there's a part that as a younger person, you may not be as aware of who you are, and that grows as you mature and become more aware of who you really are as a person versus social constraints that you may have to abide by your parents' decisions or society decisions? As you mature, you have the more of your own personal strength to maybe not fall into those. And that
There's
may reveal more of who you really are. I
There's
wonder.
There's an Annie lyric to the effect that that I've got walls all around me. It takes a bit of patience to get close to me. You know, I built a lot of walls earlier. But what is the value of preferences if they're hidden? If your outward behavior is such, who cares what your preferences are? What difference does it make?
Let me put
Happiness?
up another.
Is
I
it
can
possible?
tell you from doing this as a younger employee to an older employee doing it more often, it gave me insight that maybe I didn't fully see, but I answered in the realm of what my preferences are. It gave me something to consider, and it also gave me something to consider about other people. But I am not like an introverted person, so what I was saying about falling prey to society or parents, I can't say that I ever did that because I wasn't like that.
Let me try to answer your question, John, with an example from work. Here's the split the 8 dimensions, the 4 dimensions each end, between the general population and between a survey of over 3,000 people in management roles. So the general split between introvert extrovert is pretty damn close to 50-50. But in the management roles, there's a slight bias towards extroverts do better. So as someone who was a preference for introversion, I knew that if I wanted to be successful as a manager, I had to push myself into my extroversion. It didn't change my preference for introversion, but I had to behave and display myself as more extroverted. The next one's more dramatic. 75% of the 75% of the population has a preference for sensing, but that doesn't actually do well in management. You need to be much more intuitive to be a manager. You need to plan for the future. You need to take the team forward. You need to be thinking 18 months in the future, not just today. So intuition is really a value in a leadership role. So therefore, if you are a person who has a preference for sensing, that preference isn't going to go away, but you're going to have to stretch yourself into being more intuitive, or surround yourself with people who are strong on intuition so that they can fill that gap for you. So there are people who go into management role. And then the third one here, thinking versus feeling. This is especially true in America, right? It's 60-40, close to evenly split. But especially in America, 77% of the population are T's. You have to be cool, objective, and logical to be a leader in America. So if you have a preference for F, and I've had clients to do this, honey, you're going to have to put that F away and just be more logical. I know that's not your natural, but you're going to have to do that to succeed in this company as a manager. So people can present, they can push themselves. It's not violating yourself. We all have these gifts. It's just we have a spot somewhere along the line that's kind of our default, and we push ourselves into the other. I don't know where you have a default. I don't know where it was originally, but either when you were off, you were pushing yourself one way before, or you're pushing yourself now. I don't know. I do know, for example, that I am very mild on the last two. And when I was in college, I kind of leaned towards the perceiving, because who cares? I got no deadlines except maybe the end of the semester. Once I took a job in corporate America, I leaned the other way. So I gave myself permission, because in order to be successful, you got to be decisive, right? Judging and leadership, or you got to be decisive. So I was able to lean either way because I was close enough to the middle on those. Did my underlying preference change? No. But all I did was externalize what I needed to be successful in that situation. But that's why I'm saying the theory behind this is there's an underlying preference that we simply manage around and extrovert around. So you have had this wonderful gift of really playing a wide spectrum. I don't think you've changed. That's true. Your external behaviors change. The underlying parts of you, wherever I guess it's just pedantic now. There's a point on a line somewhere that says this is what your default preference is. It's unknowable to anyone. I'm curious though, because I find that the more I work with people, the more they can say, well, yeah, that's probably my default. But when I'm at work, I have to be more decisive, and I have to be more whatever. That make any sense?
Take a look at the two numbers on feeling and thinking for managers. I was a manager for 30 of my 40 years. And I went from 75% thinking to closer to my retirement, when I was fed up and irritated by the job, to 75% feeling. And there was a disconnect. I could feel that disconnect. And the minute I retired, I maintained the feeling as opposed to thinking.
Right. So you didn't have to perform anymore. You didn't have to push yourself into that uncomfortable territory. You just answered my question. You just proved it to me. That
But
when you were,
what's pre-morbid? I mean, what's the default?
for you, the default is probably now, because you have less constraints on you now. So the person you are now is probably what your defaults are closer to. But then again, even that's hard to say, because by the time you reach our age, we've learned to kind of play such a broad spectrum of it anyway that we can kind of enjoy a big piece of it, a big space of it. It's hard to know. It's worth thinking about actually where you are in these. And I have given you such a tidbit of it.
Yeah.
Take the class. There's a lot more to it, actually. There's a lot more. I had to fly through it and I didn't have a chance for any exercise. And most of these are interactional. So most of the way you validate this stuff is in conversations and interactions with other people. So maybe you can kind of,
you've given me a seed of thought for a blog entry.
there you
And
go.
that is, I wrote recently that in high school, I was exploring poetry quite a bit. And the minute I got in the real world in college and work, zero. And then once I retired, I got back into poetry, back into haiku,
Mhm.
and published a little haiku book. So yeah, this is going to take some thinking.
So it sounds like you are masterful at adapting to the requirements of the situation. You were really good at, way better than I was actually, by the sounds of it, of adapting to the context. You realized quickly that to be successful in this work environment, I had to be this kind of person, and you became it, independent of what your underlying preferences were.
Had a pretty pathological youth. Not that I was,
Right.
but people around me were. So I had to adapt and change. Oh man. And then I got stuck in a career that got me out of the military. So I was forced to do those 40 years.
So that's really answering exactly like she said, everything she was saying, because that's what you're saying now is explaining all of that.
Mhm.
And I was saying, I've never had to have those constraints, even as a little kid. I just did what I was doing.
Yeah.
Whether my parents liked it or not. But most people I know had to conform, and I'm not a conformist much.
Mhm. And you just are master at adapting, John, really master at adapting. A lot of my coaching work, I often start with this because then I have to then help them adapt to what their work requires. And part of the homework with the coaching client is we got to also discern what the kind of general Myers-Briggs of the organization is. And that comes from making a pretty good guess of what all the people are. I can tell by someone's LinkedIn profile about 75, 80% right. Definitely I can hit the I versus E most of the time. The others take a little bit of luck. It often takes I often have to read recommendations. If someone's written you a recommendation, I can usually pick out the Myers-Briggs from that, the other categories. But anyway, we try to determine what the organization is, and then I help them adapt. Because you have a preference for introversion, you've got to be more extroverted. Let's figure out how to do that. You have a preference for feeling, you've got to be more decisive if you want to be a manager. If you just want to be an individual contributor, no problem. But if you want to be a manager, we've got to somehow learn how to push you into that decisive mode and be more thinking. And you're going to have to fire people now and then. And I know that's against you, but then you can't be a manager, right? So that's what you'll have to learn how to adapt to that.
John, I have a question just out of curiosity. During your life as a younger person, during your life as work, and during your life now, I'm assuming now you're happier.
Oh yeah.
During those other phases, did you always feel like you were working at your optimum? Or was it hard? I guess to me, and I don't know if this is even accurate, Heather, but did it seem like it was natural to do the things you were doing, or did it seem like it was hard? Because when I was managing, it didn't seem hard.
It was very unnatural.
Okay.
Because as an introverted person, I had a job talking to people and manipulating people. And I knew right from day one, this is a mismatch. But I had no choice.
And you use this to get out of the military? How?
It was, Heather, it was either do what my temperament was not aimed at,
right,
or go to Canada.
Okay, so that was a way to avoid going into the draft?
Well, so I went, my mother-in-law was killed in a car accident when I was 21. So we moved up to Alpena to take care of my wife's 6 and 12-year-old siblings. And we were determined to go to Canada to escape the draft. This was 1968. I went for an interview with a local guy, and he had turned down people with master's degrees, but hired me with just 1 month out of undergraduate school. I went down to Lansing to the inner sanctum of the director, and he interviewed me and hired me. And he said, "Oh, by the way, I don't know if anyone told you, but this job will be a draft exemption for you, a draft deferment for you."
Nice.
And, you know, like 1,000,000 pounds was lifted off my shoulders. Started a family and kept it for 40 years.
Wow.
But there was this mismatch. I mean, there's
Yeah.
no question
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, that was fun. Thanks,
Yeah.
guys. Thanks for
I
letting me
really
do that.
appreciate you putting this together, and
I do have a crib sheet if you
Good.
guys want me to send it to you. I have it.
Yeah.
It's actually an 8-pager. I'll probably do it tomorrow. I got to run downstairs now, but I'll send you guys. I call it a quick cheat sheet. That's what I call it. But there's 2 pages for each of the 4 categories, and it's especially helpful if you're trying to figure out somebody else, because you don't really need them to do assessment. You just go down there's like a dozen different categories for each one. And then the left side thinks of it this way, the other side thinks of it this way. And you can kind of say, yeah, this sounds like Susie, this sounds like Tom. So it's really helpful for that. I'll send them right now. All right. So I'll send you
Okay.
my cheat. There's enough borrowed information in there that I can't distribute it widely. So just kind of keep it. I usually just give it to clients, but please don't post it anywhere or anything,
Yeah.
because it's like 80% mine or 20% mine and 80% somebody else's. And I don't remember who. So I don't distribute it too widely, but happy to send it along. So it's on its way. Okay.
Sounds
now
great.
you showed a 16 square grid of the
Yes.
different combinations, and some were highlighted in green, maybe yellow.
Oh, you know what? That was part of a exercise I was doing with a particular team. And those were the
Oh.
4 members of that team.
Okay.
Sorry
I
about
just-
that. That's a good catch. And we were
Why
going
they were-
through an exercise of, given that's where we are. In that case, the manager was introverted and the 3 employees were extroverted, and we had to figure out how to deal with that. So yeah, that was
Well,
interesting.
thank you very much.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
Heather.
Thanks, you guys. You're awesome.